A ring can hold more truth than a man's whole confession, and on an ordinary afternoon in Millbrook, Texas, a plain gold band set with a green stone was about to unravel a secret that had been buried for 16 long years. The saloon smelled of wood smoke and spilled whiskey that afternoon, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that never announces the moment it's about to become unforgettable. Rosalind Bell moved between the tables the way she always did, unhurried, steady, a woman who had learned young that the world rewarded quiet competence and punished complaint. She had grown up without a father's name and without a mother's voice past the age of 6, raised instead on the hard floors of a church orphanage and the harder lessons of counting flour sacks and correcting a cook's sloppy arithmetic. She carried one inheritance only, a story her mother used to tell about a ring, rare and beautiful, traded away in a desperate winter for money that mattered more than shine. It was a small ache Rosalind rarely let herself feel. Until the door of the Millbrook saloon swung open, and the richest rancher in the state walked in on business that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with her, all at once. August Renwick set his hand on the table beside his coffee cup without thinking, the way a man rests a hand he's worn a ring on so long he's forgotten it's there. But Rosalind saw it. Gold. A green stone worn smooth with age. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. "Sir," she said, before caution could stop her, "my mother had a ring like yours." The words landed heavier than she intended, and she watched a man built from 30 years of guarded silence go still as stone in front of her. "Where," he asked, careful as a man walking across thin ice, "did your mother come by a ring like this one?" She told him what little she knew, a trade made in a hard winter, a name that might not have been real, a mother who died of fever when Rosalind was only 6. August did not leave when his coffee went cold. He ordered another cup, and then a third, until Rosalind finally set the pot down without being asked and told him, not unkindly, that sleep might soon become a stranger to him. He came back the next day, and the day after that, circling questions around her the way a man circles a fire he's afraid might burn him if he steps too close, asking about her birthplace, her age, whether her mother had ever spoken of Texas. "Sir," Rosalind finally asked him directly, "did you come back today for the food, or for my mother's story?" He looked at his untouched coffee for a long moment before he answered. "Today," he said quietly, "I believe I came for both, though I owe you a great deal more explaining than I've given you so far." He rode home that evening with a name circling in his mind that he hadn't allowed himself to speak aloud in over 20 years, a name from a courtship conducted in stolen summer afternoons along a fence line that no longer existed. And a search, long ago, that he had always believed had simply failed him. For 22 years, August Renwick had told himself a lie so complete he had never once questioned it, that Evangeline Sterling had vanished from his life because she chose to, and that his search for her afterward had simply come up empty through nothing but rotten luck. Now, sitting in an old desk drawer full of stage line receipts he'd kept without knowing why, he began to understand something far worse. Someone had walked him down that road on purpose, in exactly the wrong direction, one false lead at a time. He remembered the search now with new eyes. 2 cousins in San Antonio who claimed, with what he had believed was genuine regret, to know nothing. A stage line agent who swore, with real confidence, that a woman matching her description had boarded a coach for New Orleans. 3 weeks he had chased that lie across half of Louisiana, sleeping in coach stations, showing her description to every innkeeper on the route, until he stood in a boarding house that had never once heard the name Sterling spoken beneath its roof. He had ridden home from that failure a changed man, quieter, more careful, and considerably less willing to trust his own certainty about anything. Now he understood why the trail had gone cold. It had never been a trail at all. It had been a wall, built brick by someone who wanted him to stop looking. He sent for Elias Kirby, his father's old accountant, retired 11 years but sharp enough still to recognize his own handwriting in a column of figures decades old. Together they traced a debt called in early, considerably earlier than its terms allowed, financed by the very inheritance August's brother Cornelius had received when their father divided the estate. "Your brother always said numbers don't lie," Kirby told him, his voice low with a guilt he'd apparently carried for years. "I've come to learn in my old age that men lie with numbers every day of the week. I simply hadn't the courage back then to say so to his face. A morning at the county recorder's office confirmed the rest. The Sterling ranch had not vanished into some stranger's hands at auction. It had been bought quietly through a holding company with a borrowed name, and folded back into the Renwick estate after Cornelius died, until it became, without August ever knowing it, the very pasture where his own cattle grazed. He had built a decade of prosperity, unknowingly, on land stolen from the woman he'd loved. And in a trunk of his brother's old effects, kept in the attic for 8 years since his death, August found 3 letters. Not draft. Not copies. 3 letters, addressed to him, written in Evangeline's own hand, and never once opened. His hands shook breaking the first seal, and what followed over the next hour aged him more than the previous 20 years combined. The earliest letter carried a hope that hadn't yet curdled into fear, Evangeline writing playfully of a promise he'd made her about a house with a porch facing west, teasing him about his stubborn love of coffee black and strong. The second, written weeks later, carried a harder edge, her family's ranch gone, her family leaving Texas within days, and news too important for paper that circumstance had left her no better way to send. The third and final letter, dated 2 months after that, was the shortest, and it broke something in him that 30 years of business and hardship never had. I will raise the child alone if I must, she had written. I do not ask you for money, August. I ask only whether there is still a place for us in the life you've chosen. She had named a town, a mission church, a priest who would know where they had gone, should he ever come looking. August sent a telegram the next morning, and when 3 days passed in silence, he rode there himself, 2 days in the saddle across country he'd never once had reason to cross, the 3 letters riding in his coat pocket the entire way. Concordia turned out smaller than he'd imagined, a handful of streets, a mission bell visible from a mile out, and a graveyard behind it he made himself not look at too closely until he had reason to. Father Whitfield had passed the year before, but his successor, a careful young priest named Father Alonzo, walked August through 40 years of parish records by candlelight. They found the baptism first, a daughter born to Evangeline Bell, the name Rosalind recorded plainly beneath it, and August's hand trembled reading it in a way 30 years of contracts and cattle brands never once managed. Then, 6 years later in the same careful hand, a second entry he was not prepared for. A burial. A fever. The same fever Rosalind had always believed took her mother. Evangeline Sterling, laid to rest under the name she'd taken to protect what little she had left, 16 years gone. August stood at her grave a long while that afternoon, hat in hand, saying nothing, and then rode home to sit for 3 nights running with a blank sheet of paper in front of him, understanding at last that some truths were never meant to arrive by letter, only spoken, plainly, to a daughter's face, whatever it cost him to say them. Rosalind never asked for a father. She only ever asked for the truth. What August does with that truth next, that's a story for another day. If this frontier legend moved you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, should August tell her everything, or does some truth belong buried with the past?